In the freezing darkness of December 1940, the precarious future of Western civilization hung by a rapidly fraying thread. The Royal Air Force had miraculously secured the skies. Yet the Blitz raged uncontrollably through the shattered streets of London. Luftwaffe bombers relentlessly pounded the industrial heartlands, turning the factories of Coventry and Liverpool into twisted skeletons of steel. On global maps, the British Empire appeared vast and unconquerable, a splash of imperial pink dominating a quarter of the globe. Yet inside Whitehall's bunkers, government leaders harbored a terrifying secret they dared not whisper to a frightened public. The empire was not merely bleeding soldiers on the battlefield. It was financially hemorrhaging to the point of total death. Winston Churchill, the indomitable voice rallying the free world, sat heavily at his desk in the subterranean war rooms. He prepared to write one of the most critical missives of his life to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Churchill was a master of English prose, a man capable of forging phrases into weapons of war. However, in this specific letter, he was forced to perform a delicate, humiliating dance of diplomatic desperation. He had to confess to the leader of the world's richest neutral nation that Great Britain was utterly bankrupt. The workshop of the world and banker of the 19th century could no longer pay for its own survival. The letter was exhaustive, detailing the strategic nightmare, the U-boat peril, and the urgent need for destroyers. But the true sting lay in the tale, an admission that the British treasury was completely empty. Churchill warned that the moment was fast approaching when Britain could no longer pay cash for essential supplies. He declared the British people would fight on the beaches, but they could not fight without purchased ammunition. It was a naked plea for survival and a shocking admission of insolvency from the wealthiest empire in history. To comprehend this destitution, one must examine the ruthless economics of total war that consumed nations whole. When war erupted in September 1939, Britain stood as a financial titan with billions in gold reserves. It possessed a massive portfolio of overseas investments, from Argentine railroads to vast copper mines in Chile. The City of London reigned supreme as the undisputed hub of global insurance and international shipping. But the war Hitler unleashed was unlike any conflict the world had ever witnessed before. It was a ravenous war of machines that devoured steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber insatiably. The consumption rate of these vital materials defied every pre-war calculation and logistical prediction. Crucially, the island nation of Britain was forced to import almost every single scrap of material. The Nazi blockade of the European continent effectively severed Britain from trading with its neighbors. Survival now depended entirely on looking across the Atlantic Ocean to the industrial might of America. At this critical stage, the United States remained officially neutral and politically distant from the conflict. The American public was staunchly isolationist, haunted by memories of the First World War. They remembered American boys dying in European mud and refused to be dragged into another foreign slaughter. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts, specifically designed to keep America disentangled from European wars. These acts contained a specific, hard-nosed clause known famously as cash and carry. The law stated belligerent nations like Britain could purchase American supplies only under strict conditions. They had to pay for goods in cash immediately and transport them on their own vulnerable ships. There would be absolutely no loans, no credit extended, and no financial mercy shown. Americans were willing to sell the weapons of war but demanded gold on the barrelhead first. For the first year, Britain drained its treasury dry to meet these unrelenting American demands. In a desperate secret mission dubbed Operation Fish, the government liquidated its gold reserves. They loaded the nation's entire wealth onto battleships and fast liners for a perilous journey. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in history, shipped to vaults in Canada. Billions of dollars in gold bars and negotiable securities were sent into exile to satisfy the American bill collectors. By late 1940, the gold was gone, and the liquid cash reserves had completely evaporated. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington sat paralyzed with essential contracts piled high on their mahogany desks. They could not sign them because London Treasury officials whispered the terrifying truth that no dollars remained. When Roosevelt received Churchill's desperate letter, he fully understood the existential stakes of the moment. He knew with certainty that if Britain fell to the Nazis, the United States would be the next target. Yet he faced a formidable political problem that prevented him from simply writing a check to an ally. Strict American laws forbade direct financial gifts, and the public would be outraged by a charity handout. He needed a strategy to assist Britain that appeared to be a hard-headed, pragmatic business deal. He had to sell the war effort to a skeptical American taxpayer as a matter of national self-interest. Thus, the ingenious concept of Lend-Lease was born within the strategic minds of the administration. Roosevelt explained it to the press using a deceptively simple, folksy analogy about a house on fire. He argued that if a neighbor's house is burning, you don't haggle over the price of a garden hose. You simply lend him the hose to extinguish the flames, and he returns it when the fire is out. It sounded generous and simple, a neighborly act of assistance that masked the complex reality. But behind closed doors in Washington, the negotiations were anything but a friendly conversation between neighbors. It was a foreclosure proceeding between a ruthless bank and a client on the brink of bankruptcy. Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the man in charge of the American treasury, held the fate of Britain in his hands. He was a staunch anti-fascist who desperately wanted to help Britain defeat Hitler's tyranny. But he was also the fierce guardian of the American taxpayer and demanded total financial transparency first. Morgenthau demanded a forensic audit of the entire British Empire, leaving no stone unturned. He required a comprehensive list of every asset owned by the government and private citizens globally. He insisted on knowing the precise value of every shell casing and every share of stock. Sir Frederick Phillips and the British negotiating team were absolutely stunned by this intrusion. They were being forced to open their sovereign books to the scrutiny of a foreign power. Britain was treated not as a fighting ally, but as a failed company entering receivership. Phillips argued desperately that selling long-term investments in wartime would be financial suicide. He explained that a fire sale now would yield only pennies on the dollar for valuable assets. Stripping Britain of overseas income would leave the population destitute long after the war ended. Without these foreign assets, the country would be unable to feed itself or rebuild its cities. Morgenthau remained completely unmoved, citing clear and strict instructions directly from the president. The United States would provide no aid until Britain had scraped the absolute bottom of the barrel. The American logic was brutal, unsentimental, and politically necessary for Roosevelt's administration. Why should an Iowa farmer pay for a tank if a British lord still owned a factory? The most painful symbol of this forced liquidation became the case of the American Viscose Corporation. This massive industrial giant was the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States. It was the jewel in the crown of Courtaulds, a major British industrial concern. The company was highly profitable, sending millions in dividends back to London to balance trade. Morgenthau identified American Viscose as a prime target for immediate and forced liquidation. He demanded the British negotiators sell it and deposit the cash directly into the US Treasury. The British fiercely resisted, knowing the company was worth over $100 million even in a depressed market. They argued that selling such a massive asset in a panicked rush would be nothing short of financial suicide. But the Lend-Lease bill was currently fighting for its life against isolationist attacks within the American Congress. Morgenthau needed a sacrificial lamb to prove to skeptical senators that Britain was truly bleeding financially. He delivered a cold ultimatum: sell American Viscose immediately, or the Lend-Lease bill would die in committee. On Sunday, March 15, 1941, the British government bowed to the immense pressure from Washington. They seized the American Viscose Corporation from its private owners without asking for permission or consent. It was a compulsory purchase order issued under emergency war powers, executed with ruthless efficiency. A group of American investment bankers handled the distress sale and drove a mercilessly hard bargain. The company was sold for roughly $54 million, a figure that amounted to legalized theft. The British government was forced to reimburse the original owners in pounds, increasing their own internal debt. Meanwhile, the dollars from the sale flowed directly into the US Treasury to pay for rifles and engines. This sale marked a psychological turning point, where the British elite realized the true price of the relationship. They were not equal partners, but a junior entity being systematically stripped of assets to pay for survival. The United States was absorbing the accumulated wealth of the British Empire, not by conquest, but by contract. While financial negotiators argued over stock prices, another desperate deal was being cut regarding the Royal Navy. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than the beleaguered British shipyards could possibly replace them. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers to protect the lifeline of supplies crossing the Atlantic. These were World War I-era ships, sitting in mothballs, obsolete, rusting, and of little value to America. Roosevelt agreed to provide the ships, but again he demanded a heavy geopolitical price in return. In exchange for 50 rusting hulls, the United States demanded 99-year leases on strategic British bases. This chain of military outposts stretched across the Atlantic, from the frozen coasts of Newfoundland to the tropical Caribbean. The Union Jack was effectively lowered in Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana to make way for American boots. Consider the sheer magnitude of this trade. An empire handing over the keys to the entire Western Hemisphere. Britain granted the United States a military footprint that would project American power for the next century. All of this was surrendered for 50 elderly ships that were barely seaworthy enough to cross the ocean. It was a geopolitical fire sale, a desperate nation hawking the family silver to buy a loaf of bread. By the time the Lend-Lease Act was finally signed into law in March 1941, the coffers were empty. Britain had been stripped clean. The gold was gone, the investments sold, and the strategic bases leased away. In public, the Lend-Lease Act was hailed triumphantly as the arsenal of democracy saving the free world. It was presented as a noble, selfless act of solidarity between English-speaking peoples fighting a common foe. Indeed, it provided the tanks, planes, oil, and food that kept the British heart beating against the Nazi onslaught. Without this vital lifeline, the Nazis would likely have starved the British Isles into a cold, dark submission. However, the financial terms laid the groundwork for a post-war world where Britain was the permanent debtor. The aid was never a gift. It was a lease. And like any lease, there would eventually be a reckoning. Buried in the dense diplomatic text was a clause known as Article 7, a poison pill for the empire. It stated that in return for aid, Britain must agree to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. Imperial preference was the economic wall of tariffs that bound the British Empire together as a single trading unit. It ensured that British goods remained cheaper in markets like Canada, Australia, and India than American competitors. By signing Article 7, Britain was effectively agreeing to tear down its own economic defenses and invite destruction. As 1941 bled into 1942, the geopolitical dynamics shifted seismically with the American entry into the war. After the catastrophe of Pearl Harbor, Britain and America finally stood shoulder to shoulder as fighting allies. The British Isles were transformed into an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the mighty United States Army Air Force. But even as soldiers fought together, the financial disparity between the two nations widened into a chasm. American industry, fueled by massive government spending, exploded in size, efficiency, and global dominance. The United States economy grew by staggering percentages every single year, untouched by enemy bombardment. Meanwhile, Britain's economy was being systematically distorted and cannibalized by the ruthless demands of total war. Britain effectively ceased all exporting, sacrificing its trade revenue to focus entirely on immediate survival. Every single factory was converted to war production, abandoning the consumer goods that drove the economy. It walked away from its lucrative, established markets in Latin America and Asia, leaving a vacuum. And who stepped into those abandoned markets to sell goods to the world? American companies did. While British factories were frantically churning out Spitfires to defend their skies, American factories did something else. They produced Spitfires, but also refrigerators, radios, and cars capturing the global market share permanently. The United States was fighting a war while simultaneously seizing Britain's commercial future with both hands. By 1944, the transfer of wealth and power across the Atlantic was absolute and irreversible. The gold reserves of the world had physically migrated from the vaults of London to Fort Knox. The financial center of gravity had shifted decisively from the City of London to Wall Street. Yet, the final and most crushing humiliation for the British Empire was still waiting in the wing. The British naively believed that their immense sacrifice would be honored by their allies after the victory. They believed that because they had bankrupted themselves to save the world, America would treat them generously. They had tragically forgotten the brutal lesson of the viscose sale. In high finance, gratitude is not legal tender. On August 15, 1945, news of Japan's surrender flashed around a jubilant, weary globe. In London, ecstatic crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, lighting bonfires and chanting for their king in pure joy. The tyranny of the Axis had been crushed. The British Empire had stood alone against darkness and prevailed. But across the Atlantic in Washington, there was no sentimentality, only a cold bureaucratic machine switching gears. 7 days later, President Truman signed an order that devastated the British economy more effectively than any German bomb. With a single stroke of a pen, he terminated Lend-Lease abruptly and absolutely with zero transition period. The order was immediate. American Liberty ships in mid-Atlantic, loaded with vital food for Liverpool, turned back. The lifeline was severed instantly, paralyzing the British government, which had assumed aid would continue during Reconstruction. Their economy, completely distorted to fight a common war, was given no time to adjust to peace. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist, looked at the national ledgers and stared into the abyss. Britain imported half its food and almost all raw materials, paying for them entirely with Lend-Lease dollars. Without those dollars, Britain faced instant bankruptcy, not in a year, but in a matter of weeks. Keynes calculated a financial Dunkirk. Rations would be cut to starvation levels, leading to mass unemployment and collapse. There was only one humiliating option remaining. The once mighty Britain had to beg for its survival. In September 1945, a dying Keynes boarded a ship for Washington, exhausted and suffering from heart disease. The century's greatest economic mind was traveling to America not as an intellectual equal, but as a desperate supplicant. Keynes believed he had an unassailable moral case to present to the hard-faced U.S. Treasury officials. He planned to argue that Britain had sacrificed its entire economy for 2 years while America remained neutral. Therefore, the United States should provide a $6 billion grant, a retroactive payment for blood and treasure spent. He called it justice, a settling of accounts between friends who had fought the same enemy. But when he arrived in Washington, he found that justice was not a currency the Americans recognized. The mood had soured, the war was over, and the American public was tired of paying for Europe. Congress was deeply suspicious of the newly elected British Labour government and its socialist platform. They refused to use American capitalist tax dollars to fund nationalized industries and social experiments in Britain. The American negotiators, led by the stone-faced Fred Vinson, looked at Keynes with cold, unblinking eyes. They told him bluntly there would be no gift, no grant, and absolutely no retroactive payments. There would only be a commercial loan with interest, and it would be far smaller than requested. Keynes was devastated, pleading that crushing Britain financially would destroy a vital ally against the Soviets. But the Americans held every card in the deck and knew Britain had nowhere else to turn. They offered a loan of $3.75 billion, barely enough to keep the lights on. It came with poisonous strings attached, designed to strangle the last remnants of Britain's economic independence. The most lethal condition was the demand for sterling convertibility within 1 year of receiving the loan. This meant anyone holding British pounds could immediately exchange them for precious US dollars on demand. Americans framed this as free trade, but in reality, it was a weapon to smash the sterling area. Keynes knew this condition was a death trap that would drain the loan in a matter of weeks. He fought against it until his health finally broke. But the only alternative was national starvation. Reluctantly and bitterly, the British Parliament voted to accept the loan, calling it a financial Munich. The loan was signed in July 1946, and Keynes died months later, his heart broken by the stress. Then came the winter of 1947, the coldest in living memory, burying Britain in snow and misery. On July 15, 1947, the trap snapped shut as Britain made the pound fully convertible. The result was a financial massacre, exactly as Keynes had predicted with his dying breath. Global markets instantly rushed to dump sterling, draining Britain's precious dollar reserves in a frantic torrent. After just 5 catastrophic weeks, the government slammed the window shut, having burned through millions for nothing. This humiliation signaled the official moment the baton of world power dropped from London and passed to Washington. A secret telegram was sent to the US State Department, resigning Britain's role as the guardian of the Mediterranean. It admitted Britain was too broke to stop communism in Greece and Turkey, forcing the Americans to step in. This triggered the Truman Doctrine, the formal acknowledgement that Britain was no longer a superpower. By 1949, the pound was brutally devalued from $4.86 to just $2.80. Overnight, the British people became 30% poorer, confirming their economy was no longer competitive. But the bill for the war was a mortgage that would span generations of taxpayers. Every single year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a massive check to the United States. Through the boom of the 50s, the gloom of the 70s, and the Blair years, the payments continued. The final installment was paid on December 29, 2006, closing the book at last. 60 years after the victory parades, Britons were still paying for the privilege of surviving World War II. In the modern era of total war, victory proved to be a negative-sum game for the empire. Germany was destroyed, Britain was bankrupted, and the United States emerged as the solitary, colossal winner. America did not conquer the British Empire with armies. It bought the assets in a distressed liquidation sale. Churchill saved his country from Hitler, but the deed of sale required trading the empire for survival. Britain emerged as a moral giant but an economic pygmy, having sold its future to pay for doing what was right.